Welcome to Grimfire.
They didn't come to you first. No, that would have been too easy. They went looking for cracks, for whispers, for someone, Anyon, who could explain you, expose you, shrink you down into something predictable. So they gathered your enemies, one by one, sat them under bright lights, leaned in close, and asked the question everyone's been dying to ask. What is he really capable of? And that's when it got interesting. Silence. Not hesitation, not confusion. Silence. The kind that makes people shift in their seats. The kind that crawls under your skin and stays there. These weren't your friends protecting you. These weren't loyal allies trying to guard your name. These are people who wanted you to fail, who waited for your downfall, who studied you, hated you, underestimated you, and still nothing. Because the truth is they've seen enough millions. They've watched you operate in ways they couldn't predict, couldn't control, couldn't even explain without sounding insane themselves. They've felt the pressure of your patience, the quiet way you move, the way you don't react when expected, the way you build something in the dark, while everyone else is busy laughing in the light. They know that speaking on you isn't safe, because once you've seen how deep something goes, you stop pretending it's shallow, Bleander. So they chose silence over exposure, because talking about you would mean admitting they miscalculated, that they stood too close without realizing what they were dealing with, that what they thought was harmless was actually something far more deliberate, far more dangerous, far more controlled than they ever imagined. And now the same people who once had opinions don't even have the courage to form sentences anymore. They went looking for something simple, a weakness, a pattern, a story they could repeat to make you sound ordinary, something they could carry back like proof. See, he's not that complicated. He's just like the rest. That's what they wanted. That's what they expected. Because it's easier to deal with someone when you can define them, box them in, reduce them to a few predictable moves. Lemnis. So they started digging. They watched you from a distance at first, trying to map you out like a routine equation. Step 1, step 2, reaction, outcome. But the numbers didn't add up. You didn't follow the script they were used to. You didn't respond when you were supposed to. You didn't break where most people break. In fact, the pressure seemed to do something else entirely, something they couldn't quite put into words without sounding like they were exaggerating. So they got closer, band. They talked to people who had crossed you, people who had every reason to speak badly about you, to tear your image apart, piece by piece. They expected details, mistakes, flaws, moments where you slipped. They expected anger, maybe even satisfaction in exposing you. But what they got instead was hesitation, careful words, pauses that stretched just a little too long, eyes that didn't quite hold steady, because describing you meant admitting something uncomfortable to lend. It meant admitting that you don't react like they do, that you don't chase noise, don't rush decisions, don't reveal your hand just because someone provokes you. They've seen moments where they thought they had you figured out, only to realize later they were 10 steps behind something you had already calculated. And saying that out loud, that would mean confessing they misread you from the beginning. And nobody likes to admit that. Triumphed. So the deeper they looked, the less clear you became, Q. Not because there was nothing there, but because there was too much, layered in ways they couldn't easily separate. Every answer led to more questions. Every attempt to simplify you made things more complicated. You weren't chaotic. No, chaos is easy to spot. You were controlled in a way that looked like chaos from the outside, but underneath it, there was intention, precision, timing that didn't match anyone else's clock. And that's what unsettled them, Lend. Because once they realized that, the whole game changed. It wasn't about exposing you anymore. It was about understanding how they had been so wrong, how they had stood there, confident, thinking they knew exactly who they were dealing with, while you were quietly operating on a completely different level of awareness, a level they hadn't even considered as a possibility. Man, so when they tried to put it into words, something stopped them. Not fear in the obvious sense, not panic or intimidation, the kind of hesitation that comes from knowing that whatever you say won't be enough. Or worse, it'll be completely inaccurate, and once you speak, you're committed to that version of the truth. You can't take it back. You can't reshape it without exposing your own confusion. Right? And they've already felt what it's like to misunderstand you. Once. Penned. They're not eager to do it again, Lend. So they circled around the question, avoided direct answers, gave vague responses that sounded like something but meant nothing. Because the moment they tried to define you clearly, they'd have to admit that you don't fit into anything they understand, that you operate in a space where their usual rules don't apply, where their instincts fail them, where their experience doesn't give them the advantage they thought it did. No. And that realization, that quiet, uncomfortable awareness, is something they'd rather keep to themselves than risk saying out loud. Your enemies didn't go quiet because they suddenly grew a conscience. Don't confuse silence with respect. It's rarely that noble. No, this kind of silence is colder, more calculated. It comes from a place people don't like to admit exists. The moment they realized they were wrong, and worse, that they were confidently wrong, they had you figured out once, or at least they thought they did. Mongda. You were easy to label back then. Predictable. Another name in a long list of people they believed they could outplay, outthink, outlast. They spoke about you casually, like a solved problem, laughed at your moves, questioned your decisions, dismissed your patience as hesitation. In their version of reality, you were already behind, already losing, already understood, and then something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. That's what unsettled them the most. There was no big announcement, no obvious turning point they could point to and say, that's when it changed. It was subtle, quiet adjustments, small moves that didn't look important at the time. But over time, those small moves started stacking in ways they couldn't ignore anymore. And suddenly, their assumptions stopped working. The reactions they expected from you never came. The mistakes they were waiting for didn't happen. The pressure they applied didn't break you. It refined you. And now they were stuck in a position no one likes to be in, watching someone they underestimated operate with a level of control they never accounted for. That's where the silence started, Dan. Because speaking now would mean revisiting everything they said before. Every joke, every dismissal, every confident claim about who you were and how far you'd go. And none of it lines up anymore. The version of you they described doesn't exist. Or maybe it never did. Maybe it was just something they created to make themselves feel comfortable. And now they have to sit with that. Land, because if they speak, they risk exposing the gap between what they believed and what's actually real. They risk showing everyone that they didn't just misjudge you, they misunderstood the entire situation. And that kind of admission doesn't just weaken their words, it weakens their position. So they choose the safer option. They say nothing. But it's not an empty silence. It's heavy. It carries memory. Think about you. It reminds them of the moment they realized they weren't in control of the narrative anymore. That the story they were telling about you had slipped out of their hands, and now it was rewriting itself without their permission. And they've seen enough to know better than to speak too soon again. Because the last time they made assumptions, it cost them. Maybe not publicly, maybe not in a way others could easily see, but internally they felt it. That quiet shift in confidence, that hesitation creeping into their thoughts where certainty used to live. And once that crack appears, it doesn't disappear easily. So now, even when they're asked directly, they hesitate. Banter not because they don't have opinions. Oh, they do. But those opinions are unstable now, built on a foundation that's already proven unreliable. And the last thing they want is to put those thoughts into words, only to watch them fall apart again under the weight of reality. Banged. Because you've already done that once. Bland. You've already taken everything they believed about you and turned it into something they can't defend anymore. And that kind of experience leaves a mark. It teaches them to be careful, to hold back, to observe longer than they used to question their own instincts before trusting them. So, when the moment comes, when they're given the opportunity to speak, to explain, to define you in front of others, they feel that hesitation tighten around their words, and they stop, not out of respect, out of self-preservation, banged, because they've learned something the hard way, that talking about you isn't as simple as it used to be, that every word carries a risk now, a risk of being wrong again, a risk of revealing that they never really understood you in the first place, a risk of exposing the fact that while they were busy judging from the outside, you were quietly evolving into something they can no longer predict, no longer contain, no longer explain without unraveling their own credibility. No? And that's a position they refuse to put themselves in again. You didn't break their expectations. You made them useless. They were relying on patterns. People like them always do. It's how they stay comfortable, how they convince themselves they understand the game. Watch long enough, collect enough behavior, and eventually everyone starts to look predictable. That's what they believed. That's what gave them confidence. When it came to you, they thought if they observed closely, they'd find the rhythm, the repetition, the little tells that give everything away. Mind, but you didn't give them rhythm. You gave them fragments, moments that didn't connect the way they should. Decisions that looked out of place if you tried to line them up in a straight line. One day you were quiet when noise would have been easier. Another day you stepped forward when most people would have stayed hidden. Sometimes you ignored things that demanded attention, and other times you reacted to details nobody else even noticed. From the outside, it looked inconsistent. Maybe even random. That's where they made their first mistake. And they assumed inconsistency meant confusion, that it meant you didn't know what you were doing, because in their world, unpredictability is usually a flaw. It's what happens when someone loses control, when they start making emotional decisions, when they don't have a clear direction. So they relaxed. They leaned back into their assumptions and told themselves you'd eventually expose yourself. But you never did, because what they were looking at wasn't chaos. It was variation, controlled, intentional variation. Every move had a reason, but the reason wasn't visible from the angle they were watching. And that's what made it dangerous. You weren't following a pattern they could learn. You were adjusting faster than they could track. By the time they thought they understood one version of you, you were already operating on another, and that broke something in them, not loudly, not in a way they could admit, but internally. Their confidence started slipping because their usual tools weren't working anymore. The same instincts that helped them read everyone else started failing when it came to you. They'd predict one outcome, and you'd deliver another. They'd wait for a reaction, and you'd give them silence. They'd think they'd cornered you, only to realize later they were reacting to something you set up long before they even noticed. That's when observation turned into uncertainty. They started second-guessing everything. Every move you made felt like it could mean something more than what it showed on the surface. A pause wasn't just a pause anymore. A decision wasn't just a decision. It all carried weight now, layers they couldn't peel back, no matter how hard they tried. And once that happens, once someone stops trusting their own interpretation, they lose the advantage they thought they had. Blend. Because now they're not reading you anymore. They're guessing. Oh, and guessing is dangerous when the person you're watching doesn't play by visible rules. Pained. So they tried to adapt, tried to outthink you, to anticipate your shifts, to match your unpredictability with their own. But that only made things worse, because while they were busy reacting to what you might do, you were already done doing it. You weren't stuck in the moment the way they were. You weren't chasing clarity. You were operating without needing it, and that's what separated you. They needed consistency to feel in control. They needed patterns to predict outcomes. You removed the patterns. They needed reactions to confirm their assumptions. You denied them those reactions. So everything they relied on, everything that made them feel like they understood how people work, stopped applying to you. Blend. And once that realization settled in, there was no easy way to recover from it. Blend. Because now, every time they look at you, they're not seeing a person they can figure out. They're seeing a moving target that refuses to stay still long enough to be defined. Someone who can shift direction without warning, who can stay quiet without losing presence, who can act without revealing intention. And that kind of presence doesn't just confuse people. Mend. It forces them to accept something they're not comfortable with. Ponsed that whatever they thought they knew about reading others, predicting behavior, staying ahead, doesn't work here anymore. You didn't become dangerous by doing more. You became dangerous by doing less. They were waiting for reactions. That's how people measure control. By how quickly they can get under your skin, how easily they can pull a response out of you. A comment here, a jab there, a little pressure applied in the right place, and usually people crack. Maybe not completely, but enough. Enough to reveal something. Enough to give away their state of mind, their weaknesses, their next move. That's the game they were playing with you. Push, observe, adjust. Push again, observe again. It's simple, reliable, effective. Most of the time, But with you, the cycle broke. They pushed, and nothing happened. No reaction, no visible shift, no emotional response they could latch onto and analyze. At first, they thought it was restraint. Maybe you were holding back. Maybe you were trying to appear calm while something underneath was building. So they pushed harder, changed angles, tried different approaches, different tones, different tactics. Still nothing. And that's when the silence started changing shape. Because your lack of reaction wasn't passive. It was deliberate. It wasn't the silence of someone overwhelmed or unsure. It was the silence of someone choosing not to participate. And that difference, that small but critical difference, is what made them uncomfortable. And they couldn't read you through your reactions because you weren't giving them any. No frustration when they expected irritation. No defense when they tried to provoke you. No urgency when they created pressure. You just remained the same, steady, unmoved, present but not engaged in the way they wanted, and that removed their leverage. Because their entire approach depended on feedback. They needed to see how you'd respond so they could adjust accordingly. They needed your reactions to build a strategy. Without that, they were operating blind. Every move they made felt like throwing something into the dark and hoping it hit something real. Planned, but it never did, and over time, that started to wear on them. Because when it forces you to sit with your own actions longer than you're used to. There's no immediate reward, no confirmation that what you're doing is working. Just silence. Just your own effort echoing back at you without impact. And the longer that goes on, the more it starts to feel pointless. So they escalated, they got louder, more direct, more aggressive in the way they tried to get a rise out of you. Because in their mind, there had to be a limit. Everyone has one. A point where they finally break character, finally show something real. But you didn't, not because you couldn't, but because you understood something they didn't, that every reaction is information. Lenged, every moment of frustration, every defensive word, every visible shift in emotion. It all tells a story. It reveals timing, pressure points, thresholds. And once someone has that information, they can use it. Refine their approach. Get closer to control. So you gave them nothing. And in doing that, you flipped the entire dynamic. Temda. Now they were the ones being observed. Their actions stood out more clearly because there was no noise from your side to distract from them. Their patterns became obvious. Their attempts predictable. And without realizing it, they started revealing more about themselves than you ever did. That's when the balance shifted. Bland. Because they were no longer influencing you. They were exposing themselves. Planned every push without a response made them look more desperate. Every attempt that failed made them question their own approach. And slowly, without you saying a word, without you making a scene, without you stepping out of that controlled stillness, they started losing confidence in the very tactics they once relied on. And that's where the real danger showed up. Not in what you did, but in what you refused to do. Lemje. Because while they were exhausting themselves, trying to break through something that wouldn't react, you were conserving energy, maintaining clarity, staying in control of your own space, without giving them a single opening to work with. No. And the longer that continued, the clearer it became to them. Blend, that they weren't dealing with someone who could be provoked into mistakes anymore. Right? They were dealing with someone who understood the value of silence well enough to turn it into a weapon they thought exposing you would be. Just pull back the curtain, point out a few flaws, connect a few dots, and suddenly the image collapses. That's how it usually works. Find the weak points, highlight them, and let the rest take care of itself. People don't need much, just enough doubt to start questioning everything, so they step forward with that same mindset. Confident, certain, ready to speak, because in their version of events, they had already done the hard part. They had watched you, judged you, measured you against their own standards, and decided exactly what you were worth. And once someone reaches that level of certainty, talking becomes easy. Words come out sharp, clean, convincing. There's no hesitation when you believe you're right. But certainty is fragile when it's built on incomplete understanding. And that's what they started to feel. Not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse, but slowly, quietly. A series of small realizations that didn't fit with what they had been saying about you. Moments where their own explanations started to sound thin, stretched, like they were forcing a narrative that didn't quite hold together anymore. And at first, they ignored it. Everyone does. It's easier to double down than to reconsider. So they leaned harder into their original opinions, tried to reinforce them, tried to speak with even more confidence than before. But something was off. The more they talked, the more they felt it. That subtle disconnect between what they were saying and what they had actually seen, blend. Because what they had seen didn't match the story anymore. Demmed. They had seen you stay composed when pressure was designed to break you. They had seen you make decisions that didn't make sense in the moment, only to realize later those decisions were setting something else up entirely. They had seen outcomes that couldn't be explained by the version of you they had been describing. And that's where the problem began, because exposing someone requires clarity. It requires a stable understanding of who they are, how they operate, where their limits are. Without that, every attempt to define them becomes a risk. Every statement becomes something that can be challenged, picked apart, proven wrong, and they could feel that risk growing. So the words that once came easily started to slow down. They began choosing them more carefully, softening certain claims, avoiding specifics, leaving space for interpretation. Not because they suddenly respected you, but because they no longer trusted their own conclusions enough to state them with confidence. And once that doubt enters the process, everything changes. Because now, it's not just about exposing you. It's about protecting themselves. They started thinking about how their words would sound later, how they would look if things continued unfolding in ways they didn't expect, how easily someone could come back and say, "You were wrong." And that possibility, that simple, unavoidable possibility, made every sentence heavier, because being wrong in private is one thing, being wrong in front of others, after speaking with confidence, that's something people go out of their way to avoid. So they hesitated, plumbed, they replayed scenarios in their heads before speaking, questioned their own interpretations, considered the gaps in what they knew. And the more they did that, the more they realized something they didn't want to admit. Belend, they didn't understand you well enough to expose you. Not completely, not accurately, not in a way that wouldn't come back to challenge them later, And that realization doesn't just stop someone from speaking. It changes how they see the entire situation. Blend. Because now, instead of looking at you as someone they can break down and explain, they start seeing you as something more complex, layered, something that doesn't reveal itself all at once, and certainly not in ways that can be easily summarized or simplified. And once that perception shifts, confidence disappears, because confidence depends on clarity, and clarity is exactly what they lost. Again, so when the moment is there, the attention is focused, and all they have to do is speak. They feel that hesitation rise again, that awareness that whatever they say might not hold up, that it might sound convincing now, but fall apart later under scrutiny. And they've already felt what that's like. So instead of risking it, instead of stepping forward and committing to a version of you they can't fully defend, they take a step back. Plender. They hold their words. They let the moment pass. Because staying silent may not give them control, blind, but it protects them from losing what little certainty they have left. At some point, silence stopped being a choice and became their only option. Not because they ran out of things to say. That's the easy explanation people like to believe. No, they still had thoughts, opinions, half-formed theories about you. But none of it felt safe anymore. None of it felt solid enough to survive outside their own heads. And once words start feeling fragile like that, people get very careful about when they use them. Because they've learned what happens when they speak too soon. Blend. They've already experienced that moment when confidence turns into exposure. When something they said with certainty gets quietly dismantled by reality. It doesn't happen loudly. There's no announcement, no dramatic correction, just a slow realization that what they believed doesn't match what's actually happening. And that kind of realization lingers. It sits in the back of the mind, reshaping how they approach everything after. And especially you, because you were the variable they couldn't control. They tried. At first, everyone does. They tested boundaries, looked for consistency, searched for a reliable version of you they could lock onto. But every time they thought they had something concrete, it shifted. Not randomly, not emotionally. Just enough to stay out of reach. Enough to make their conclusions feel incomplete the moment they tried to rely on them. And that's what made speaking dangerous. Because words require commitment. Once you say something out loud, you attach your credibility to it. You're not just expressing a thought. You're standing behind it. And if that thought collapses later, it doesn't just disappear. It reflects back on you, on your judgment, on your ability to read a situation accurately. They've already felt that reflection once. Meant they know how it feels to have their certainty questioned, even if no one says it directly. To sense that subtle shift in perception, where people start looking at them differently, not because they made a mistake, but because they were so sure they wouldn't. That's the part that lingers. Not the error itself, but the confidence that came with it. So now, they avoid that risk. Plend. They measure every thought before it turns into a sentence. They test it internally, run it against what they've seen, what they've missed, what they might still be misunderstanding. And more often than not, it doesn't pass their own test. Not because it's completely wrong, but because it's not complete, not stable, not something they're willing to stand behind if it gets challenged. And with you, it always feels like it could be challenged. Blend. Because you don't stay still long enough to be defined in a fixed way. You don't operate within the boundaries they're used to. There's always another layer, another angle, another possibility they haven't fully accounted for. And that uncertainty turns every statement into a risk calculation. So they stop calculating They choose silence, not as a strategy, but as a shield, because silence doesn't expose them. It doesn't commit them to a version of events that might fall apart later. It doesn't give anyone anything to question, analyze, or turn against them. It keeps them neutral, untouched, outside the consequences that come with being wrong. And after everything they've experienced trying to figure you out, that feels safer. Bend. But there's something else underneath that silence, something they won't say, even to themselves. Plead. Because every time they hold back their words, every time they choose not to speak on you, they're acknowledging something without admitting it directly, that you've moved beyond their ability to define, that whatever framework they use to understand people doesn't apply here anymore. No, and that's not an easy thing to accept, so they don't accept it. They just stay quiet, and they let others talk, speculate, guess. They step back, observe from a distance, careful not to involve themselves in conversations that require certainty, because certainty is exactly what they lost when it came to you. And without it, every opinion feels unstable. Every conclusion feels temporary. Every attempt to explain feels like it's missing something important. Jamband. So they keep their distance. They keep their thoughts contained. They keep their words unspoken. Prand. Because in a situation where every statement could turn into another mistake, silence isn't just safer. It's the only position that doesn't cost them anything